But I think as a follow-up to the conversation that we had earlier regarding the landscape and understanding the trends that we saw, Tom certainly did a great job in understanding and bringing out the lessons that we can learn from leaders across the continent. And given the words that they shared with us, resilience, sustainability, and of course, perhaps consolidation, while still seeking growth, these are all elements that we need to bear in mind as we continue to engage in our conversations throughout the course of the next 2 days. Some hard lessons and of course, single-digit returns becoming a lot more realistic about the results we're looking for. But to help us understand a lot further regarding interesting trends that continue to be highlighted at seminars such as this, especially being the rapid rate of urbanization, we're going to get a presentation now to give us some insight into the geography of African investment, and this follows the release of the State of African Cities report. Ladies and gentlemen, to give us some insight in this next brief presentation, please warmly welcome to the front of the stage the Chair in Economic Development at Wits University, Ronald Wall. A warm welcome.
So good morning, everybody. I was supposed to start at 10, so I hope that I at least get my 20 minutes, if not more, because it's quite a long presentation and it deserves the time. I'm not an economist or a specialist in investment, but I'm an economic geographer, and I analyze big data to understand the actual patterns of investment in the world or within Africa. Can be regions, could be cities. So it's very much what we call spatial econometric research. And what's interesting about it is that it also visualizes actually what's going on. So they say like a picture is more than 1,000 words. Is the kind of work that I do. So we're looking at the geography of African investment, and I'll get into the picture later on. The work that I'm showing you today is based on a research report that I developed over the last 5 years for UN Habitat in Nairobi, which was financed by the African Development Bank and the DFID in London, and different universities, Erasmus University and Wits University and Peking University. And what you see in front of you, there's 2 versions of the report. You can download it for free. There's an English one and a French one. And there's many topics, as you can see above. The ones highlighted in blue are the ones that I'm going to touch on in my presentation. So please see the presentation as a kaleidoscope of different ideas that have come from the research, but not necessarily that you have to understand the depth of it yet. But if you are interested in these topics, please download the report, and it's a PDF form, and you can get the details on each chapter. So more or less a 300 to 400 page report on all the topics that you see above. So, for those who don't know what foreign direct investment is, the research is based purely on foreign direct investment, or FDI. It doesn't include domestic investment. So technically it means investment that crosses the border. So it would include investment from Lagos into Johannesburg, but it wouldn't include investments from Cape Town into Johannesburg. And that's simply because that kind of comparable data is not easy to find. On the other hand, foreign direct investment is very powerful investment, which can kickstart a lot of economies and projects, bring knowledge, technology to destinations. The second point is just saying that, of course, I'm not the only one who does this kind of research, and many studies show that FDI is a major contributor to economic growth, which, of course, in Africa is stimulating rapid urbanization, and that in turn leads to huge development in real estate and property markets. Now, particular to my kind of work is I do a special branch of statistics called network analysis. And the type of work I do is understanding our cities, let's say, within an investment system, where the flows of capital are going between thousands of cities, And how do you analyze that? That gives you very particular understanding of a city, not just how much it attracts, but who the sources of investments are, what is your changing position in the total relative system of the economy. So that will become clearer as I move forward. Can somebody at the control there just get this movie started? At the bottom left, there's an arrow. Yeah, thank you. So what I've developed at Erasmus University in the Netherlands and at WITS is a huge database of foreign investments to about 1,200 cities and towns of the world. So what you see now is not a visualization, but a simulation of the real investments that took place. And so you get an idea what I'm talking about now. I'm an economic geographer. I try to understand where these investments take place on the globe or different points. So the higher the peak means that simply within a 15-year period, that would be an area with a lot of investment, and smaller peaks, of course, gain less. So you can see Mr. Trump's area, how highly invested it has been in over the last 15 years. You can see Europe on the right, top right. But as you go down to the global south, where the most people live, we see a much more sparse amount of investment. Just a few peak cities, like in this case, Rio and Sao Paulo, do get a lot of investment. Africa, still quite sparse, but it has its peaks, like Lagos and Nairobi and Johannesburg. And as you get to the Asian continent, still the data is quite sparse, but there are huge peaks like Hong Kong and Shanghai. So that's the kind of data that I analyze, and you can simplify all that data I just showed you into this easy graph. So the vertical line in the middle is, on the left of it is negative growth, on the right of it is positive growth. So looking at the continents, where has all this investment gone and how much, and the growth. What's very interesting is you see on the bottom right that Africa has the second highest growth rates of investment within the period 2009 to 2016, only surpassed by North America. So its volume of investment, the size of the dot, is not that strong, but the growth rates of investment are huge, and particularly the last 3 years, so this is only up to 2016, has been an enormous boost where Africa is now #1 in terms of attracting investment. So I think that's a very good positive sign for us how to gain interest for future work. Now, the same data can also be mapped as network data, and the database has over 200,000 investments from city to city, and if I switched it all on, the screen would be black. So this is just showing you the hardcore backbone of the world economy. You see here the top 10,000 investments that took place within that period. And you quite immediately see a few things. We see that most investments is indeed between countries and cities in the global north. We do see that the global south is still rather excluded. The little blue dots in Africa, for instance, do have investments, but they're of a much smaller magnitude. We'll see that in the next slide. But there is, somebody mentioned it earlier today, there is greater forces out there that also determine our fate. So the fate of African cities and development is not only determined by what we do within our cities and our countries, but these huge capital flows actually have huge influence on the outcomes of the investment in our areas. So what do we do about it? That becomes the important question. Now, for Johannesburg or Gauteng, out of 12,000 cities, it's number 69 in the world economy. So it's impressive. We do have a city that has its tentacles connected all over the place. And this is simply look at inward investment. If you looked at outward investment, you would indeed see that Gauteng is starting to penetrate European and American markets. So it's the only global city, in my opinion, because the one that attracts most investment is Cairo, but it receives its investments from the Middle East and from East Europe, so its focus is much more regional. But we receive our investments from all over the place. So we are the real African global player. If you switch on the investments to Africa, we can see a few myths being bust. One is that there's a lot of investment between the South-South relations. In fact, there might be some emerging, but there's not as much as you would expect. The biggest investor into Africa remains Europe because of our unfortunate history, but the culture, language, and religions have actually had an influence on our future development with Africa. China is a big investment area, but its volume is not comparable to Europe, but its growth rates are one of the highest. So that makes the difference there. If we now look at Africa, so the investments between cities within Africa, we can see that Gauteng is the spider in the web of Africa. It's really the primary investor into many places, especially in West Africa and East Africa. The other big one is Casablanca from Morocco side, investing much more in Francophone and Arabic states. But particularly what you see there is it might look impressive, but if you compare that to Europe, these are the flows of capital between European cities and regions. And you can see it's about 100-fold denser than what happens in Africa. So the argument here, and been tested in a lot of statistical research, is that our regional investments and ties are still very weak. And we have to build them, make them very strong, which in turn will attract a lot of foreign investment from distant places. So that's the analysis that you'll see next. So this is an argument that the African Free Trade Agreement is the good start, but we need to make sure that even in SADC or with our neighboring countries, that we hyper-increase trade and investment flows at a much more proximate area. That will give us a sustainability and resilience to attract big investment and to play them out in the future. Now, don't worry about the statistics too much. This is just an econometric test that actually proved that. So this kind of regional gatewayness of being connected locally to local cities and countries proves here across 69 world cities that is a big determinant of the amount of foreign direct investment you attract from far away. So we need to find ways to build up our regional ties and do that quite fast, but also sustainably. Now, part of that will be looking at the infrastructure of Africa. So in this study, we actually tested the road networks of Africa. So all those brown, orange lines you see there are the main roads in Africa. And the black ones are the soon-to-be Trans-African Highway. So there's already an idea that developed in the 60s, and now with the African Free Trade Agreement, these road connections are actually going to be completed to actually connect Africa physically better. So we did a statistical research in which we could calculate for every city in Africa, like Joburg or Cape Town, how physically connected is it to every other city in Africa, which is actually the market reach. And out rolls a kind of indicator, a measure that you can use. And then the hypothesis was that if you test that to attract foreign investment, does it actually have a big influence on foreign investment. So we did it first with the brown roads, and then we added the black highways to it to see if there would be an expected increase. So again, the statistical results, don't worry about it too much. I also will give my presentation to the organizers who can distribute to everyone freely later, if you credit me, at least for the work. So if you can't see the details, just take your time at home whenever you have it. You see two outcomes, the yellow ones, which is the orange roads, which show a high significance impact of road connectivity in attracting foreign investment to these cities. And the blue ones is where we added the black highways to it, and indeed, there was quite a significant increase of amounts of investment you can attract, because investors are often not only interested in your own city, but they try to also penetrate wider regional markets. And the next step would be, say, where are the weaknesses in the road network and how can we repair those so as to increase markets, get returns on investment to us, but also open up markets that weren't there before for us. So that's kind of the idea behind that, which means that as investors in Johannesburg, we might also have to invest in infrastructure in other parts of Africa to unlock markets in which trade and investment flows can continue. Now, what are the determinants of attracting investment in Africa? The first one, of course, is domestic regional market growth because of the booming urbanization going on in Africa. The other one is proximity to customers, which now means what I showed before is if you are connected to bigger markets, that's very important for multinational firms and investors to come. The business climate is number 3, so we have to make sure our business climate is good. Then fourth is skilled workforce. Now, the ones that are orange are actually the top 4 in Europe, and we need to make sure that we raise those ones. We need to make sure that our students from our universities have the qualifications to match the rise of investment demand around the world. So all the different sectors that are growing, we should have our students per art so that they can work with firms, because often firms like a Chinese firm say, look, we want to work with your people, but they're not skilled enough, so therefore we bring our own. So that educational impact and power will have a big influence. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them. One is interesting, which is important, is Europe, is the presence of very strong IPAs, investment promotion agencies, and strong marketing mechanisms. That is hardly evident in Africa, and even in South Africa, they're just normally stuffy offices somewhere in a block, but not serious marketing institutions to actually hunt for investors and bring them in contact with projects in our cities. Some other things that are interesting. The women's participation in the formal labor force in Africa bears no significance on attracting investment. But when we did the same analysis on Asia, we found an extremely high significance. So women's participation in Asia really pumps up about 40% of the investment flows into the area. So it's a serious point to be taken, is how do we enable women into formal labor? I'm not talking about agriculture or informal economies, but how do we get that component? Because we're missing half the picture in our business world. The others are corruption. Across Africa deters investment. That was a negative sign. So it's a message again and again and again and again to our own government, is we have to really get rid of corruption. And the last 3 is simply telling us that the higher the democracy level of a country, the more investment flows there are. So some countries are not fully democratic. That will actually deter investment in Africa. Now, I'm going to show you something now, which is how to measure economic competition within flows of capital, and I hope I don't bore you with it. We all assume that countries and cities are competing equally for investment, but in fact they're not. They might be competing for completely different sectors. And these competition wars take place at local levels, regional and continental and global. So the forces affecting us are from many scales. So imagine the world only existed out of 5 cities. We can see Johannesburg and Lagos. They both attract the same size and types of investment from those other 3 cities. So you can see that Johannesburg gets its investment from A, B, and C, different magnitudes, and we see the same for Lagos, right? So in that situation, they would be 100% competitors because they're replaceable to investors. Their properties that they have in their city are of such that investors could choose either one of them. Now, if Lagos had 2 other cities investing in it, that would change the game. So then possibly there's only a 65% market overlap of the investments taking place. Now, to do it properly in a huge matrix database of 200,000 investments, that would be humanly impossible. So, of course, we use softwares to analyze that. And it's a little bit more complicated. The model also looks at the different sectors that are being invested and also the source of the investment, where it's coming from. And then you run the model, and actually within a few seconds you get the results. So we've done it for the report. On the left, you see that based on the sectors and the sources of the investment, that Johannesburg's, in the global scenario, biggest competitor is Bogota in Colombia. That's because you just leave the model open to any part of the world. And you can see in the images the different industries that make them competitors. Obviously, if those industries were 100%, they would just fall on top of each other, and you would only see one radar line. The third biggest competitor globally is Chicago. That simply means that those 3 cities have a very similar investment profile. Now, the other side are the competitors of Cairo. So we can see here that cities like Al-Manama and Vilnius are the competitors of Cairo. So it's an interesting proposition to you, is how we can start using big data and machine learning and particular skills to actually get a better grasp on who our competitors are. So I've lived in the Netherlands a long time, and I did the same research for Rotterdam, and they expected, of course, Amsterdam would be their number 1 competitor. But in terms of investment, it was only its 12th biggest competitor. And the real competitor of Rotterdam was Lyon in France because of their transport hub status. So it's interesting to use this research to become quite focused and clear on which cities you're actually dealing with and which ones you compete with. Now, this is, you can look at home, but it just shows you on the left, for instance, Shanghai. Shanghai receives the most investment in the world. And you can also see in the list of Shanghai that its competitors are the heavyweight cities like Dubai, New York, and that kind of place. Now, it's not because I chose it, it's just the way the model gives you the results. So you could say Shanghai is boxing a heavyweight league. Huh? And if you look at Johannesburg, we again see its competitors for the globe or for Africa or for other parts. And we can see they're slightly more middleweight competitors. It's competing at another level. And if we take Kigali right on the right-hand side, we'll see that almost all its competitors are in Africa. Now, it's not because I told the machine only select from Africa. It could select any city in the world, but through the analysis shows a much more regional cluster of investment attraction. Now, what makes it like that is the diversity of sectors. So, as I'll show you in the next image, on the left-hand side, we see a vertical line, and that's basically the position of Shanghai in the world. And that's the axis of Shanghai. And we see a big arrow going to a big cloud of all those thousands of cities. So that big arrow shows it has hardly any competitors. They're very far away. And it's because Shanghai has such a specialized sectoral diversity that no other city can out-challenge it. So it has hardly any competitors. Its first, more or less, one is Dubai. So it's actually on its own with a very unique, specialized profile of investment sectors. Now, if we compare that to Rwanda, we can see that that arrow has shortened a lot. It means now that for Kigali, which is also now on the left, that big cloud of all the cities in the world has actually moved closer, meaning it's under threat, under huge competition, and that's because its sectoral profile is very common to the others, which means that for investors it can be replaced quite easy. You can choose many cities in Africa who could do the same job. So the message behind here is how to get cities to specialize into new sectors and at the same time diversity into a broader range of sectors. That will give us less competition from other cities, which would then make us more resilient and more sustainable. So looking at the flows of capital into Africa, we see quite an interesting thing. Despite what everyone always said, that Africa is purely commodity, we can see it's now much more in knowledge-intensive sectors. So there's a lot of pool of sectors for cities in Africa to now diversify in. We don't have to imagine that we're only capable of commodities, which you can see are at the bottom of the line. There's a negative growth in metals and ceramics and these kind of things. But it's the other ones that you wouldn't expect, like healthcare, renewable energy, and real estate, and food. Those are actually starting to boom across the continent, and we should start tapping more into diversity in those. Now, earlier on, somebody mentioned the importance of sustainability and inclusiveness. What these three maps show is that foreign investment is very uneven. It actually reinforces spatial and economic inequality around the world. So we should also take into heart the fact that what type of cities do we want to create? If we think we're following the model of the developed world or the West, what has the West really brought us except the highest inequality rates ever this year, where 1% owns almost all of world capital, and the biggest effect on climate. So before we too quickly build our real estates and invest in properties, please sit back and consider what kind of cities do we want. Maybe we shouldn't follow the West. Maybe we can actually set the example to Western cities about how to do it in a sustainable and inclusive way, maybe at a slower rate, but actually to change that mindset. So what you see on the left, for instance, is the foreign investment in Johannesburg. And you can see it follows the north axis, let's say from Rosebank all the way going up to Midrand and Pretoria. So in a sense, it's also reinforcing the structure of apartheid. And if you look at the world, it's those global economies reinforcing the structure of how the world operates. And in Africa, we can see there's only unique areas that control investment, often at the expense of others in the world. Anyway, so we did a test, and we did prove indeed that that foreign investment actually does reduce inequality around the world, but only in the hub cities or areas that get it, like that picture I showed you before. The big problem with foreign investment is the distribution of investment within a country. So Joburg claims a lot, but the distribution to smaller cities is very weak. And in that sense, it creates or increases inequality. So in our cities, we have to think about how to redistribute investment for properties and real estate to get a more even, spatialized structure. The last few slides are just some I quickly did 2 nights ago on real estate investment, and I'll quickly do it. So you can read it later, but just to show you in terms of the number of investments and the capital expenditure of investments over the last, let's say, 15 years, there is a strong growth in Africa. So that's a good sign. You can also make separate maps per sector. So this is the map, the geography of real estate investment around the world. Please take your time at home to look at it. You'll see that most investments are up in the northern part of Africa and a few areas in Mozambique and in the west of Africa. This is the most recent data up to today, just showing you which cities receive the most real estate investment. On the other side, it also shows you in which activities like construction or sales and marketing are these real estates investments taking place. And unusual compared to Europe is that the investors here are only looking at the moment to the domestic markets, but not the regional markets. If you do the same analysis in Europe, it's the other way around. So we need to start seeing our cities as systems, as polycentric systems, and how do we market that also to property and real estate investors to grow into that bigger regional web. This is just showing you the sources of investment, and also I gave you a list of the top 30 investors in Africa, the actual firms itself, so you can explore that later. And what are the determinants of real estate investment? Now, regulatory quality is very important across Africa. The freehold land ownership has a non-significant effect because investors are interested in actually capturing property, and if people simply hold onto those properties over time, then it's of course no interest. So any place good at that would actually be not interesting for investors. What has a negative effect is rigid town planning. So we found across Africa, using policy documents, that the more rigid the town planning structures are, the more that deters investment. The number of days to get building permits has a negative effect on investment. Urban population size and urban growth rate, well, that speaks to the rapid urbanization. It's a very positive sign for investors. But also the total investment that the city receives. So in this case, it's saying that all the sectors combined, if there's a lot of that coming into your city, then that will have a very positive effect on the real estate investment attracted. The control of corruption, again, if you control it, has a positive effect. And also if your investment areas are in proximity of special economic zones, gives some form of control in Africa which tends to attract investment. Then I've got everything summarized for you, but I think because of the shortage of time, you can just look at it at home. These are the general things that actually determine investment in Africa, and I think I'll just move on. So please get the PowerPoint and also download the 300-page report. There you can get into the nitty-gritty and details of the whole thing. And if you need my details, you can find them on this last page. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand it to you.